My name is Martin Matter with the Witness to War Foundation. It is March 20th, 2023, and we are in Destin, Florida. I'm sitting with Mr. Roland Guidry, G-U-I-D-R-Y, who served in the Vietnam War in the United States Air Force, as well as in Iran and participated in Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada to an extent. He served in Southeast Asia with the 350th Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron. Later was commander of the 8th Special Operations Squadron, amongst other details. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Well, Roland, I appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to speak with me. My first question is, where are you from originally?
A little Cajun town called Breaux Bridge, B-R-E-A-U-X, Bridge, Louisiana. Spoke French as my first language and educated by nuns, Catholic high school, and suffered from very little vocational guidance, being in the backwoods of Louisiana. My first cousin was in the Air Force, so that sounded good enough for me. So graduated valedictorian of my class and went on to college at the Ragin' Cajuns, University of Southwest Louisiana, now known as Louisiana Lafayette, and then went into the Air Force through ROTC. Most of my Air Force career was associated with flying the C-130 aircraft.
Before we get into all that, I want to hear about your folks. What were your parents like?
My dad was a truck driver, had a little business of his own as an Exxon distributor. Mother was a housekeeper, had one sister, and we lived in the little town of Breaux Bridge, 5,000 population. Grandparents were farmers and merchants, just middle America.
Now, you mentioned your first cousin was in the Air Force. Was there any other military history in your family at all?
Not at all. No, I respected him greatly, and he went to navigator school, became a navigator, and the closest thing I had to a role model, he grew up next door to me in the house next door, first cousin. So if the Air Force was good enough for him, probably good enough for me. But as I said, I was educated for 12 years by nuns, and just really had no idea about vocational guidance or that I could have applied to an academy and gone there or whatever. Probably would have been accepted. I was valedictorian in my class. But things worked out pretty well.
Maybe on a personal note, but did you maintain the Catholic faith for most of your service?
Yes, and we still practicing Catholics.
That's great. So you were in ROTC in college, and any memorable experiences during ROTC?
Not really. That's the first time I ever got into an airplane, when I was a senior in ROTC and went through college as an electrical engineer. Didn't really have any idea about what profession I wanted other than something technical, engineering, and figured out what to do. Once I got in the Air Force, I'd probably have some guidance from then on. As it turned out, my second career was in real estate, so I had a pretty diverse life.
Truly. Do you remember what the first aircraft you were in was?
A C-119 flying boxcar. It was a base visitation where they picked us up in Lafayette, Louisiana, and took us to an Air Force base to acquaint us with what Air Force life was all about. And we did have what was called the flight instruction program, where the government paid for us to take private lessons. Once it was determined we had the aptitude to be a pilot, then in our senior year, we were given 45 hours of instruction in private airplanes. And I finished in about 30, so I got 15 extra free hours to fly. And that was very nice. Took a couple of girlfriends up and had a good time.
So any memorable flight instructors?
They were tough as nails in pilot training. I went through a class with academy grads, who probably had a lot more military training than I. So that was a motivation for me to do well, because most of my class were academy grads. In other words, a B class, as we numbered them, A through whatever, started right after the summer. So that meant that recently graduated academy grads were in that class. Mm-hmm.
So during that time, the war in Southeast Asia had really ramped up. What did you know and think about what was going on in Vietnam as you're going through ROTC?
Didn't really know much about it. What affected my early Air Force career was the Air Force was in the process of changing training airplanes from the T-Bird, T-33, to the T-38. And Webb Air Force Base was the first Air Force base to get the T-38. And as luck would have it, I was not assigned to Webb. I was assigned to Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, Texas. So the Air Force wanted instant feedback as to how students fared once they went through pilot training in a modern fighter aircraft, which is the F-5 or the T-38's, the trainer version. So when we graduated, we were allowed to choose our assignment based on class standing, but all of our assignments were fixed wing. So therefore, when the C-130 assignment was still available when I finished midway through my class, midway in the ranking, then I chose the C-130. And it was a good airplane for me, fit me personality-wise. And I flew very strange, highly modified versions of the airplane most of my career.
As I understand, you flew the ski model the most?
Yes, after pilot training at Reese Air Force Base, the squadron that I chose, or the assignment that I chose, flew the C-130D model, which was a model fitted with skis, very large skis, and they're still, the original airplanes are not flying anymore, but that capability is still in existence, flying in the Arctic, in the Antarctic primarily. And that was available, and I took that assignment. It resulted in a 5-year assignment in the ski model, 2 years in Texas and then 3 years in Alaska. And I did a lot of flying in the Arctic. Alaska is very challenging, and especially in those days, there were about 27 or 28 radar sites in Alaska that were situated on tops of mountains and on plateaus or whatever, and had very challenging airfields to fly into. So we had 2 missions, actually. We had normal missions where we landed in a wheel configuration, where we landed on wheels at these radar sites, a gravel runway or whatever. And then we had an assignment also we had to take care of on the Greenland ice cap. In the early days, we had concern over the Russians coming over the poles, and therefore there had to be a string of radar sites all the way from England to the last of the Aleutian Islands. That was called the DEW line, Distant Early Warning Line. And in order to maintain radar continuity, there had to be 4 radar sites in Greenland, 1 on each coast, and then 2 up on the Greenland ice cap on the plateau. And they had to be resupplied with fuel and food and medicine and rotation of personnel back and forth. So we would go temporary duty to a base in southwest Greenland called Sandestrom and stage out of there to resupply these 2 radar sites. That was one of our missions, and the other was just normal C-130 operations on wheels. So the airplane could land on wheels or skis.
I remember you saying in one of your interviews, you probably landed in Greenland 50, 100 times.
At least, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
And it's like flying inside of a milk carton. When we got ready to land at a radar site, then on a date where there was no shadows, in other words, the white ice cap blended right into the white sky, then what we had to have was some kind of a depth perception vehicle. So the radar sites, the two radar sites we would land at, had designated a runway, with quotes, a runway next to the radar site, and then aligned it with bamboo poles. And then they would take pairs of poles and stretch metallic material all the way down between the poles. So the radar navigator could turn up the gain on the radar high enough so that, because there's nothing else out there except the radar site and these bamboo poles, that's it. So he would turn up the radar gain high enough so that on short final approach, he could pick up the metallic material in his radar. And then we would limit the angle of bank for landings to 15 degrees. And we would come in right above stall in case we landed early than we thought we would land. And that provided the depth perception. But what's unusual about ski operations is that normally you think landing is the challenge. In ski operations, the takeoff was the challenge. And the reason for that is people don't realize the sliding friction of an airplane on wheels may be high, but you take the same airplane and you put skis on it, and the sliding friction is much higher. So we had a hard problem accelerating the takeoff speed. So if we were to admit defeat, then we had JATO bottles, jet-assisted takeoff, in the back of the airplane. So if we tried several attempts to take off without firing the JATO, then we would admit defeat and say, okay, on the next run, now that we have packed the runway by several attempts, circle back, attempt, so the combination of pack, snow, and JATO would normally let us take off. And the takeoff procedure was quite unique. You have a nose ski and two main skis, and we would accelerate to as fast as we could without firing the JATO, but all three skis in the snow. So if you could reach 55 knots, then the procedure was the pilot would take the yoke, push it forward, and kind of pop it back in an attempt to get the nose ski out of the snow. Now, if you were down to two skis instead of three, your drag would be eliminated or reduced. So now you're on the main skis, still accelerating, hopefully. And then when you get to about 80 knots, then pilot would just gingerly lift the airplane into the air. And the C-130, being a propeller airplane, has a unique advantage in that the engines are in the front of the wing. So therefore, even when you're sitting down and the engines are running, you have wind prop wash going over the wings, creating lift already without moving. So therefore, we would take off maybe 85 knots. And the flight manual had a big warning in it that said, ski operations require you to get airborne much earlier than minimum control speed. Now, what does that mean? That means if you lose an outboard engine right after liftoff, you don't have enough airflow over the rudder to counteract the asymmetrical thrust of losing an outboard engine. So the Dash 1 mention would say, therefore, ski operations are a calculated risk. So it was interesting flying.
No kidding. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody about this sort of flying. Now, this might be a bit of a repeat question, but that war in Southeast Asia and the years you've been flying C-130s, it's gotten a lot hotter. Was going into a combat zone something you were interested in, or were you trying to stay out of that sort of thing?
No, I wanted to serve my duty in the combat area. And while I was still in Alaska for 3 years, there was an opportunity. The Air Force was building a base at a Vietnam coastal city called Tuiwa, Tuyhoa, and it was a turnkey operation where Walter Kitty Construction Company was building the whole base. But Walter Kitty needed a C-130 far removed from the normal, what we used to call Klong Airways, the airplanes, the C-130s that flew back and forth throughout Vietnam. They needed one far removed from that, dedicated to their operation. So the Air Force said, why do we have C-130s where we can pull one and let it be dedicated to the construction company? Because their Far East base of operations was in the Philippines or Taiwan, one of the two, depending on the time of the year. So at that time, they were operating out of Taipei, downtown Taipei, as their Far East base of operations. So they needed a C-130 to go back and forth every day with supplies and people. So the Air Force says, Alaskan Air Command has C-130s. Let's take one of theirs and dedicate it to the construction company for Far East base operations. So I volunteered for that and spent 4 weeks downtown Taipei, flying every other day into Vietnam. So that was my first exposure to Vietnam. And then my next assignment, because now I had some pretty meaningful C-130 experience flying the ski model, very challenging operations in Alaska. The Air Force said, now we'll send you to a C-130 squadron that requires a lot of experience and know-how. So that was the squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Tucson, Arizona. And the existence of the ski model, the airplanes at Davis-Monthan, has to do with the U-2s. We had 2 U-2s shot down, one of them over Russia and one of them over Cuba. And that was primarily because the Russians had developed the SA-2 surface area missile. So therefore, now the U-2 is vulnerable, can't get high enough to escape the SA-2. So the Air Force said, how can we still carry out photographic intelligence? Because now we're talking about the early 60s. And in those days, satellites were not developed enough to do what they do now. Now satellites take pictures and send them instantly to the States. And the intelligence is captured right away, even if the vehicle is shot down later. But in those days, we had to capture the film, and we had to process the film. So they said, why don't we take the principle of the U-2, reduce its size a little bit, and develop it into a drone instead of a manned airplane. But then how do we launch it? So therefore they said, well, the venerable C-130, we can probably modify stations under the wing and launch them from under the wing of a C-130. So that meant developing a top secret squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson. It was a SAC C-130 unit. Why was it SAC? Because it was, in those days, we had a delineation between strategic reconnaissance and tactical reconnaissance. So if we're going deep into enemy country, or we are photographing things dealing with their infrastructure or their manufacturing aspects, then we called that strategic intelligence. And therefore it was a SAC unit. If we called it tactical intelligence, then normally that would be a fighter aircraft with a camera in the nose that would be taking immediate pictures of a battlefield environment. So I went to the squadron and got checked out. And about that time, the Russians spent a lot of money and effort improving the defenses in Vietnam as the war started heating up. And it got to the point that if you look at the triangle between Vinh, Haiphong, and Hanoi, that triangle, the defenses were so great there by the Russians that the normal tactical reconnaissance vehicles couldn't survive. That would be the RF-101, the F-4, RF-101, whatever. The Navy counterpart, they could not get low enough to survive the triple threat of the Vietnam defenses, which would be SA-2s, AAA, and MiGs. So the Air Force said, we have this strategic reconnaissance squadron that flies C-130s, that launches U-2s that are mimics of a C-130, of a U-2. So why don't we clip the wings of these drones and come up with a low altitude model that might be more survivable than the tactical reconnaissance squadrons that are losing airplanes like right and left. So when I got to the squadron, we were launching, sometimes we would launch a high altitude drone, which means we'd launch them at about 3,000 feet, and they would come off the wing and then they'd climb to 80,000 feet and mimic the U-2 mission. But then as the war heated up, the role of low altitude drones increased. So now we're launching at 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet, and the drone, instead of being long wing U-2 replicas, they were short wing stubby drones. And they would come off the wing of the C-130 and go down to about 500 feet, 400 feet. And they were self-programmed to go in on their own by a planned route. So that the planner ahead of time would be given a set of targets, a set of coordinates. So the crew members under my control as an aircraft commander, 2 or 3 days before the mission, would meticulously take a map and plan the whole route. They had to know the turn radiuses, everything else. So when a drone has to turn and to go toward a new, different target, then they had to know exactly where it would roll out. Because now you had a different problem. If a drone comes off the wing and goes to 80,000 feet, then it doesn't matter if you launched it a half mile right or a half mile left, because it's going to be taking pictures from so high that its swath is going to be great. And it doesn't matter whether you've offset the route of the drone by a half mile or a mile if it's at 80,000 feet. Different story at 300 feet, because if it doesn't get close to the line of travel between the targets, then it's going to miss its targets altogether. So we had a unique problem in doing everything we could to try to get the drone to launch as accurately as possible. Now, nobody realized when they said, okay, let's clip the wings of the drones and let them go in at a low altitude. Nobody realized that, well, now the C-130, which has a weather radar, 5-inch scope, not very big, now that's going to be its primary launch device to try to find where to launch from by painting the contrast of the land of North Vietnam. So nobody realized this would be insufficient from an accuracy standpoint as to where the C-130 would launch. But therefore, in the early days, we might only get 40% of our targets. And SAC was quite concerned that we were missing targets all the time. It's because we didn't know where we were accurately enough. So a typical mission would be, we would take off from Ben Hoa, which is where we were stationed in southern Vietnam, take off at about 4:30, 5, 6 in the morning. And we did that for several reasons. Number one, the weather in Haiphong Harbor would normally be good by the time we got there, ideal for photography. And we were concerned with sun angle as well, because there was a lot of concern as to what the ships in Haiphong Harbor were bringing to the battle and what the trains coming in from China had in their holds. So therefore, the timing was such that we would try to get a drone over the target at a certain time to maximize photography. So we normally take off at about 5 in the morning, typically. And the second reason was so nobody would see the drones, because we were top secret and we were not trying to spill the beans as to what our capability was. So those two reasons would let us take off very early. And then we would use C-130 call signs. We'd fly C-130 routes of the backbone of Southeast Asia. Then we'd enter the traffic pattern at Da Nang, like we were going to land at Da Nang as what I call a normal trash hauler. The other name we had was Klong Airlines, Klong, which was a common name in Thailand and Vietnam. So therefore, we tried to mimic the flight path and mannerisms and radio calls. If we did any radio calls, we didn't do any. We were silent the whole way. In fact, when it was time for taking off out of Ben Hoa, we would taxi on our own and pull up next to the tower and do our run-up, and then look at the tower, and tower would give us a green light to take off for secrecy reasons. But anyway, we'd fly up to the traffic pattern at Da Nang, and on downwind leg, we'd peel off and go down to about 400 feet, 500 feet above the water. And for the next hour plus, we would go north, splitting the distance between Hainan Island on the right and the North Vietnamese coastline on the left. Very low altitude, so that we wouldn't be detected. And thank God there was a little island in the northern Gulf of Tonkin. The fighter pilots used to call it Update Island. The correct name was Il Bac Long. Il for island, Bac Long. And that's what we would update our navigation with. So we'd stay low until we started getting radar signals or hits on the island. And then the navigator could update the navigation gear. We normally had a time when we had to launch. So we would be adjusting airspeed en route to make the time right. Why was that important? Because we always had jamming airplanes supporting us, and we had fighter aircraft protecting us. We just had to make sure that they didn't circle right over us to divulge our position, and they would be scheduled to start their jamming or their BORCAP, which is what the fighter protection was called, at a certain time. So the timing was important. So we would get an update from Il Bac Long Island and then go into our launch run. We would normally carry 2 drones, and if we only had one mission, both drones were programmed for that mission. They were programmed the same way. They were programmed to come off the wing and go into a sequence of events where they cleared the airplane. So the first, as soon as the drone came off our wing, it went into a dive to make sure it got away from us so we wouldn't have a mid-air collision. And then it would go down to about 500 feet, 600 feet, and then its own programmer would kick in. And then it was programmed to go to certain targets, coordinates, and events had to be programmed. So it would click off each mile traveled, and then the events would be programmed on a certain mile. which means, for instance, come off the wing, accelerate, get away from the 130, go down, then the coastline is now coming up of Vietnam, and most of our launches were around 20 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. The reason for that is that for navigation accuracy, we needed to get close enough to the coastline of North Vietnam so the navigator could take his radar and go to the 30-mile range. And now he could paint the coastline of North Vietnam, and that would let him have a better chance of getting an accurate launch of the C-130. Now that poses a problem because there are SAM battalions right on the coast that were a threat to us. So we had to have a tactic to make sure we got close enough so the navigator could get his fix on the land-water contrast, but not so close that we endangered the crew from a SAM. So we had to basically, as soon as we would see the drone come off the wing and accelerate, we would bank immediately, put flaps down, and reduce the speed to 145 knots. And now in a C-130, if you put full flaps down and you fly at 145 knots, you're flying nose down. You can still climb that way, but you're not nose up, you're nose down. Now we had a chin dome, so if we turn and now the drone is on our 6 o'clock position, then the aircraft aluminum structure would block the radar signals. But if we could fly with nose down, the chin dome could look underneath the airplane and track the drone. So we were actually very vulnerable at that point at 145 knots, slowly climbing nose down away from the Vietnam coastline. And we had to do that because the chin dome underneath the normal radome had to have a clear vision as the drone is now going into North Vietnam. And now the drone is encountering terrain where it has to be programmed to start flying up a little bit. So if the drone went in, was not shot down by a MiG or AAA or a SAM, then it was programmed on its own to come back out after hitting its 5 targets, taking pictures. And then as soon as it got what we call feet wet, which means it's on the way out, it's over the water, it was programmed to climb like hell for fuel saving purposes. And it was programmed to fly off the coast of Vietnam in the Da Nang area and enter into an orbit off the coast of Da Nang, about 30 miles. And if nothing ever happened, if the ground side didn't take control or we didn't take control of the drone, it would flame out and destroy itself. So it was designed that way in case it went haywire and ended up on top of North Vietnam. Then commanding parachutes had to be a positive aspect for the recovery. If nobody ever commanded parachutes of the drone, then it would just destroy itself. And that's the way it worked. So therefore we had to retrieve the film. So it had to come back and it had to be recovered by a system called the Mid-Air Retrieval System, called MARS, M-A-R-S. It's the same system that was used to recover payloads out of satellites, except instead of a helicopter, the MARS was configured for a C-130. So in the early days, early days of the satellite business, they actually had to eject the film into a ball, a steel ball, not steel, but some kind of metal that would not burn up in the re-entry process. And the C-130s used to use the MARS system to catch that package over the Pacific. In the case of Vietnam, we used helicopters with the same system to catch the drone. So when the recovery button was pressed for the drone, that would do several things. And of course, it would not be done until in the vicinity of Da Nang, the drone being at 55, 60,000 feet, and 2 helicopters waiting below at 13,000 feet. So when the button was pressed, it would dump the rest of the fuel, flame the engine out, and deploy a small stabilization chute. And it would come down, and at 15,000 feet, a large chute would open with a cable in a loop on a small parachute on top of the big chute, and the helicopter would snag that. And then once the helicopter snagged the loop and kept going, then the cable down to the drone was attached with breakaways all the way down. So as the helicopter keeps going, instead of having a big drag chute, the main chute would break away and just sink. And they would winch it back up. And there would be T-39 aircraft, small executive jet, waiting in Da Nang to take the film quickly to Saigon and be processed for immediate intelligence. Then, eventually the film would make its way to Maryland for detail analysis, where people used to put it on a table and just spend a lot of time. And that's how the POWs were discovered at a camp called Sante. Because if you have good enough photography, then the photo interpreters can measure the reflectivity of the scalp, the shoulder width, and if they have people in a courtyard, and if it's at an angle, they can pick up a scale from something and measure the height of the people. So therefore, short person, narrow shoulders, dark scalp, Asian. Tall person, light scalp, broad shoulders, Caucasian or American. So that's how the POWs at Sante were discovered. And there's also information about the POWs using their ingenuity in how they hung their clothes on the laundry lines to divulge who they were. So by the time the raid on the Sante POW camp occurred in November of 1970, which I flew support missions for, we knew exactly who the POWs were in the camp.
Could you elaborate on the laundry thing, what they did?
Well, they would stamp out, when they were allowed to walk around the courtyard and a drone was coming over, the first thing they would do would be to look up in case facial recognition might recognize them. And then they would stomp out the last four of their social, if they could. And they would do other things with their laundry, which I probably should not divulge.
Fair enough.
It's probably no longer classified, but I prefer not to.
Sure. I remember when North Korea had our prisoners, we were doing, what was it, the thumbs up? Or no, the middle finger in their pictures, and the North Koreans had no idea what that meant. They thought it was a sign of good faith, like a thumbs up.
Well, the POWs were quite resourceful. And there's an outstanding documentary called Spy in the Hanoi Hilton. Spy in the Hanoi Hilton that I recommend. The Morse code is a series of dots and dashes. And the letters C and K are redundant. So if you say, instead of a K, I'm going to use C in its place, then you're down to 25 characters in what is called the tap code. And the tap code can be put into a grid of 5 by 5. So the reason for that is that it's hard, if you're going to bang on pipes in a POW compound, it's hard to come up with a dash. But if you put the tap code into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, in other words, a 5 by 5 grid, so a series of 2 numbers pinpoints each letter. And they're all taps. There's no dashes because you're using the tap code. So the POWs used to talk all night, boost each other's morale, and pray, do everything using the tap code, and the Vietnamese never figured it out.
Really, really amazing stuff that they were able to do.
But I highly recommend Spy in the Hanoi Hilton. You can probably get it on the internet, but it's extremely good.
So you said you flew in support of that. We were just talking briefly about it before we started.
Yeah.
Tell me more about what happened during that mission, and especially about the cloud.
Sure.
Part.
November 1970, it was an ad hoc formed for that purpose task force that used C-130s and helicopters and a makeshift forerunner of the Delta Force. That's the best way I can describe it. The whole purpose was to, and let me back up, there were about 20 something POW compounds scattered through North Vietnam. And of course, there was the famous Hanoi Hilton, downtown Hanoi. But one of the camps was 23 miles to the west of Hanoi, called Son-Tay, S-O-N-T-A-Y. And we used to launch drones over all the suspected sites for several reasons. One was morale, to let them know that we're still thinking of them, and they could listen and hear the whine of the drone engines, and they could distinguish it very easily from a fighter aircraft. Another one was to see if they were occupied and whether we could tell whether there were Caucasian or American POWs there. And as I said, we would always take the film to Saigon for immediate tactical intelligence, but then send it to the States for detailed processing. And that's where they discovered the fact that Son-Tay was occupied, and this would have been in the spring of 70, and that so therefore we started targeting Son-Tay that I was involved. Now let me break right here. There is no situation where you're the aircraft commander and you're brought in and you say you're going after Son-Tay. Doesn't work that way, because I might get shot down on the next mission. So therefore, you're just given a set of coordinates. And mission success is measured by what percentage of your targets you got, not the significance of the target. Okay? So it was kind of a flying mission that your personality had to be such that you didn't have to have headline busting discoveries that resulted in awards and decorations. You just had to say, okay, that's what I was assigned to. I'm going to do the best I can in getting drones over the target and gathering the intelligence. When we finished our assignment in this squadron, if we were lucky, we got what was called an end of tour Distinguished Flying Cross. End of tour Distinguished Flying Cross. And we got an air medal for every time we launched a drone. But my point is, never would you see in our record, Captain Guidry was significant in discovering drones, POWs at this compound. None of that, because we might get shot down on the next mission. So we were never given the feedback, or was it ever documented which crews gathered what intelligence. We just got an end of tour DFC if we were lucky.
It's all about compartmentalizing all the info you can.
Right. So it was discovered that the POWs were at Son-Tay. So this task force was developed here in the States. Most of the training was done right here at Eglin Air Force Base. And they took C-130s and learned how to fly very slow so they could lead the helicopters in, because there's a mismatch in speed. If a C-130 flies as slow as a normal helicopter, it'll fall out of the sky. So therefore, it had to be very careful about how they trained. The whole plan was to land a helicopter sacrificially right in the middle of the compound and free the hostages, put them in an airplane, take them out, and have diversionary tactics with fighters to draw the North Vietnamese attention away from what was happening under their nose. The mission went off November 20th. It was successful from an operational standpoint, but the POWs had been moved. Now, I was involved in the surge operation right before, launching drones every day. We were flying 8-hour missions with 2 crews, and we did whatever we could to try to divert attention from our operation. For instance, the most dangerous mission I ever flew launching drones was what I call the backdoor mission, which means we took a C-130 with drones around the backside to come in. Instead of going up the Gulf of Tonkin, we cut across in Laos and went on the west side and approached Hanoi from the backside to launch at 20,000 feet in daylight. And then we had a normal C-130 with no drones, but flew the same pattern as a drone launcher that would pop up in the Gulf of Tonkin like he was launching drones and try to divert all the attention to the decoy in the Gulf while we came in from the backside and launched in daylight west of Hanoi a drone at 20,000 feet. We had no idea where we were accurately enough. There was nothing to navigate with. Okay? That problem has been solved, but the point is the technology in those days were GPS was a gleam in some inventor's eye at that time. Hadn't been invented. So that's probably the most dangerous mission I flew. But in all the years, which would have been about 10 years, between 65 and 75, we didn't lose an airplane. We didn't lose. And we had operations in southern China, North Vietnam, of course, and North Korea.
It's true.
There was a great interest in trying to get a drone that would penetrate deep into China because satellites were not good enough yet to get the intelligence. I think the name of the base in China was Lop Nor, and that's where they were developing their missiles, and their technology was sort of like Area 51 for the Chinese. So they actually developed a drone. The name of the project was called Compass Era, and that was being developed at Holloman Air Force Base. And it was a drone developed from the start. Rather than modifying a target drone, this was one developed from the start that would be going in at high altitude and long range. The point is the range. And it was designed with no corners, the engine on top, all the things we now take for granted in stealth technology. You put the engine on top, that minimizes infrared detection from the ground. You provide no corners for radar reflectivity. So I was involved in that program called the Compass Era program, but it never came to fruition because satellite intelligence advanced faster than we could perfect that capability. So the Vietnam experience was primarily drones, and after 4 years in the business, I was sent to graduate school to get a master's in astronautics.
And what year is that you ceased operations in Southeast Asia?
My years of operation were 67 to 71, and most of the missions were out of Benoit. But then SAC wanted their assets consolidated at Utapao in Thailand. So in July of 70, I think it was, we moved our operation to Utah.
So you got your master's in astronautics, is that right?
Yeah, at one time the Air Force had a bunch of space programs. The Manned Orbital Laboratory, the Dinosaur, and they said we're going to need a whole bunch of astronautical engineers. And I went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, 24-month program. And by the time I graduated, all of the Air Force's space programs were in NASA. So they said, we don't know what the hell to do with you. You will be educated for most jobs. What do you want to do? I said, send me to Eglin Air Force Base in any engineering job. So the Vietnam War was winding down, and they said, we have this job at Eglin to do test and evaluation projects for equipment and tactics for special operations. Will you take the job? I said, sure. It's Eglin Air Force Base. So I, at a permanent change of station, moved to Eglin in 1973, and I was the special ops test and evaluation person for whatever came down the pike, which was very little because the Vietnam War was winding down now. And Carter, when he became president, his attitude was, if it's got the word special in it, then because of budget cuts and all that, that's probably the first area we would cut. So, for instance, the gunship was taken from Southeast Asia, had a very successful run in the Vietnam War, moved to Herwood Field, and one of the first projects was to try to button up the AC-130 so he could fly pressurized. And all of a sudden, the project was terminated, no funds. So I had other areas that I was put in. By this time, of course, the Air Force was getting into the high G environment in fighters. The F-15 was coming along. So the same office in the Tactical Air Warfare Center, known as TAWC, TAWC, at Eglin, handled special ops and other things. If it wasn't reconnaissance, fighter, electronic warfare, then there was an office called Cats and Dogs, chemical defense, life support, whatever. So that's where I was. So I did a whole bunch of different things for the F-15. Improved G-suit, the little blue helmet that pilots have been flying with for the last 30 years, 40 years, then I ran that test to come up with which lightweight helmet to buy. Because before that time, in the G environment that fighter pilots were flying in, they were pulling maybe 4 or 5 Gs at the most. And they started adorning their helmets with visors and all kind of stuff. Now they're starting to fly in the F-15 in the 6, 7 G environment. And when they pull Gs, their head ends up in their lap because of the G-force. So the Air Force had a requirement for coming up with a lightweight helmet. And you had to have the center of gravity of the helmet coincide with the center of gravity of the head. So you wouldn't have a moment arm. So I ran that test, improved G-suit, improved oxygen regulator. So most of the high G embellishments that had to be run as a test program, I managed those tests.
Was it developing like new plastics and materials that helped you achieve that?
Yeah. So that little blue helmet finally is being replaced now. But that little blue helmet, I ran that test. So I was there for a long time doing that kind of testing. Chem defense, the Air Force finally woke up that said, hey, we might be in a chemical war one day. So we better equip our pilots to be able to survive a chemical attack and still fly. So all of the stuff in 1975 era that the Air Force started developing for chem defense flying, and I ran that testing.
We talk like a lot of air filters, things like that?
right, and something to put on the pilot, because very small amounts of nerve agent will affect the eyes to where it incapacitates the pilot. So I did all that for many years at the Tactical Air Warfare Center. And then all of a sudden, in those days, to be a squadron commander of a flying squadron, you had to come out of the squadron commander's list, a potential commander. And just like the way TALK was organized, you had a squadron commander's list for fighter, for recce, for electronic warfare. You had one for cats and dogs as well, like the Airborne Warning and Control, AirWACs. I came out of the list, okay? Then all of a sudden, one of the squadrons at Hurlburt needed a commander. So I was just across town at Eglin from Hurlburt, easily interviewable. And it was the 8th Special Operations Squadron that flew the Combat Talon. Now, the Combat Talon was the unconventional warfare model of the C-130. What made it special? It had airborne refueling capability, was just coming in. And the reason for that was the Israelis had flown what is called the Entebbe raid and successfully rescued passengers from an airliner at Entebbe Airport. Right away, questions were asked in the Pentagon. Could we do that? And the answer is, if we can find friendly air bases to get to the area where the king or the dictator would let us land, refuel, and keep going. But if absent that, no, we couldn't get to that part of the world and rescue our people. So that's why the C-130s were refueled. Not all of them. Initially, only the Combat Talons and a few of them, and the gunships, and another airplane called the ABCCC, which stand for Airborne Battle Control and Command. During the Vietnam War, the way we used to command flight operations was we had a module that was put in the back of a C-130 with a big plotting board and stations where people would be on headsets with radios controlling their aspect. It was a command and control airplane, ABCCC. So they were airborne refuelable, which played a role in Eagle Claw, because now we had a C-130 where we could, if we needed to, we could take the module out, and we had a C-130 that was airborne refuelable. But anyway, that's why the C-130s were modified for refueling, because of the experience of the Israelis in the Entebbe War. Okay, so I get nominated to be the commander of the 8th SOS, flying the MC-130, called the Combat Talon 1. One of its aspects was airborne refuelable. Another aspect was it had terrain following, terrain avoidance radar. Okay? So it could go in low altitude beneath the radar. It also had a high speed back end, which means if it's got to drop things out of the back end, normally a C-130 has to slow down to 150 knots to be able to open the back end and kick out passengers, kick out packages. That's a little too fast for people to go out of the back of an airplane, more than 150 knots. The shock is too great when they hit the parachute. But the point is, the Combat Talon had a high speed back end, which means it could be terrain following and open the ramp and door at 220 knots and kick out a resupply package without having to slow down, divulge where it dropped, and then accelerate it in. So en route, while terrain following, it could resupply troops in the field. It had electronic warfare officer and electronic warfare gear that could determine whether it was being tracked. So it had a bunch of neat things that made it unconventional warfare capable. So that was the squadron I got assigned to in the spring, late spring of 1979. I had not flown for 8 years, so it took me a while to get back into the swing of things and also command a squadron. Before I got checked out and fully combat ready, the 4th of November 1979 occurred, which was the takeover of the embassy in Vietnam and in Iran. So the first thing that happened is that the telephones started coming down to the squadron from the Pentagon, bypassing all aspects of command and control between Headquarters Tactical Air Command and a squadron. Now you have all these intermediate commands, JSOC, SOCOM, AFSOC. But not in those days, you didn't have any of that. The Air Force didn't know what to do with special ops at the end of the Vietnam War. Didn't know what to do with it. So they went ahead and sent the combat talents to Europe, a few of them, 3 or 4, to the Pacific and to Eglin Air Force Base to be put at Herwood Field. But there was no structure for special ops. Whatever you had during the Vietnam War, and you had a pretty good capability for special ops in the Vietnam War, dried up, okay? Because everything special had lost emphasis, and now the emphasis was on fighters and bombers, and nobody really realized that we might have these little dirty wars with militant Islam coming up, which history shown that we did. So the embassy fell on the 4th of November in Iran. There is no telephone call to an immediate special ops force to get ready. It had to be built up like the Sante Raid. The Sante Raid was an ad hoc group that was formed for that purpose. That's the most recent one they had. So if it was good enough for Sante, the Pentagon figured it's good enough for Iran. So they assigned an Army 2-star general in the Pentagon to be the commander. They went to room 2C840 in the Pentagon, which was what was called the Special Ops Division. What does that mean? It's in J3, which is operations, and it's the keeper of after action reports from previous missions and anything to do with special ops in some war plan. That's where they coordinated it with, but there's no operational capability. Okay, so they went to that office and pushed furniture back and put tables, and that's where the planning started. And then the point is, who is going to fly this mission, and what kind of mission will it be if we have to rescue the hostages? So that's where the planning started, room 2C840 in the Pentagon, with an Army general taken from his desk job in the Pentagon, and the Delta Force was just being formed at that time. Coincidentally, on the 4th of November, the Delta Force was here at Eglin, undergoing what is called their graduation exercise. The Army likes to do that. They develop a force, and then when they think it's ready, they have an operation observed by other generals to give them the blessing that they're now mission capable. That was happening at Eglin on the day the embassy fell. So Bucky Burris, other Delta operators went to the Pentagon and started scratching their heads about how to rescue the hostages. And then the phone starts ringing at Herwood. How many MC-130 refuelables do you have now? How many crews are trained? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The first impulse of the Iran mission was punitive, not rescue. Well, let me back up. I don't want to say not rescue, but to do something to get the Iranians' attention And then if you don't release the hostages, we'll give you more of that behavior. Okay, I can't really go into what that event was, but it was a punitive option of their facilities that was planned to get their attention and give them an ultimatum. It involved gunships. So the gunships from Hurlbut all of a sudden left. And I'm a squadron commander, brand new to the squadron, can hardly spell special operations. And the wing commander goes with this group. The deputy for operations goes to that theater. So there's no special ops leadership left at Hurlbut except in the squadrons. So we became the focal point for getting the Air Force ready for a rescue mission. So we would get daily calls from the Pentagon telling us to do something tonight, be it go train with some Delta operators on refueling helicopters, or go train with the Rangers out of Fort Stewart and develop something called airfield seizure. But most importantly, the commander that we have assigned to Eagle Claw, which was the name of the mission, wants us to develop a capability to do it lights out, no communication. Lights out, no communication. What does lights out mean? The Israelis, when they did the Entebbe raid, were lucky enough that Entebbe left the runway lights on. So when they came up with a ruse to land at Entebbe to rescue the airline passengers, the lights on the runway were on. So facilitated a landing at night. You can't determine that you can't rely on being that lucky. So you have to develop C-130s, blackout landing. What does that mean? That means you may have to land at an unlit airfield and have no visible lights emanating from the airplane. So that's probably the biggest challenge we had as to how to come down final with Rangers to seize an airfield and without making a go-around, land on the first pass, totally no lights coming from the airplane and no lights outlining the runway.
As I understand, you are talking about landing 6 in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Once we finally got proficient at all we were doing, when it came to the second attempt called Project Honey Badger, then at that point we had an option to seize the international airport in Tehran, which has dual runways. So we actually practiced a dual runway airfield seizure, blacked out, in the States using Reese Air Force Base, coincidentally where I went to pilot training, that has similar topography and dual runways. So we actually seized Reese Air Force Base twice in the summer of 1980, practicing a second attempt, which never came about. But getting back to the first attempt, the early plan was punitive, but the instructions were get ready for a rescue mission where we go in under our terms. And here are the challenges. The target's in the middle of a downtown town, city of fanatics. There are two targets. There's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with three members of the embassy staff, including the charge d'affaires, Bruce Langdon, is at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a meeting with two other people. They're stuck there. Okay? The main embassy later ended up with about 52 people. It started with 63, but the Iranians released the Afro-Americans and people with medical problems and some women that brought it down to 52. So 52 at the embassy and 3 at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the planners in the Pentagon quickly came up with, got to be helicopters, because How you gonna get them out? You might be successful in getting to the target and killing the guards and getting everybody ready to go, but how are you going to get them out of town? They even talked about bicycles, like the movie Argo, okay? But they finally came up with, you got to use helicopters, so you might as well use helicopters to get them in as well. Which helicopter? Well, you can't rely on a helicopter that has to be put on a carrier deck where you can't fold the blades. It's going to be discovered right away by the Russians, and they'll spill the beans to the Iranians. So you're going to have a helicopter whose presence on a carrier can be explained away. And it's got to have the range and the size. So after a long time search, they came up with the RH-53D, which was a minesweeping helicopter. And it had wing tanks as well, so it had the range. So once you take all the minesweeping gear out, then it might work. Where are you going to launch from? Well, you got to get close enough, because the distance from the body of water south of Iran, near the Straits of Hormuz, to Haiphong, not Haiphong, but to Tehran is about 1,100 miles. So you got a long distance to go. So therefore, you got to launch close to Iran. Carrier. It's got to be a carrier. So they came up with carrier-launched RH-53D, but then there's not enough darkness in one night to do the whole ingress, attack the target, rescue everybody, and get out of Dodge in the darkness in one night. So they came up with a 2-night mission where you're going to land to refuel, because you don't have the capability at that time to do airborne refueling of those helicopters. So therefore, you probably have to land in the desert somewhere and bring in fuel on C-130s. Well, how do you know the C-130s will not sink to its wings when it lands in the sand? So the geologists started looking at topography maps. And what they were looking for was an area that was stable year after year after year. In other words, little change. And they found a dry lake bed in the Dashi-Kavir Desert that looked like it would be stable. And there was a little dirt road going through it. It was a dry lake bed. Well, if there's a road going through it, that probably means it's got a pretty firm soil. But Colonel Kyle, my boss, said, we're not risking the first C-130 unless we have a reconnaissance mission to go get soil samples. So it was brought up to Carter to have him approve a reconnaissance mission to go in with pilots from the CIA era, Vietnam era, that would 2 pilots fly a Twin Otter, take a combat controller with them, with the equipment to take soil samples, penetrometer, whatever it's called, and to come back and determine whether the soil was suitable for a C-130 at the horrendous gross weights we were flying. A normal C-130 at that time was limited to 155,000 pounds, 155. In wartime, you could go to 175. That night, the 6 C-130s were over 190. So therefore, at least the first airplane, we need to make sure it can land and not sink. So April 1st of 1980, that reconnaissance mission was flown out of Muscat, Oman, with John Carney as the combat controller. And he landed.
All right, so you were telling me John Carney was sent as the combat controller, and what happened?
He was flown in a Twin Otter by 2 contract pilots. They landed at this site. They landed, they were supposed to land south. There's a road going through. The road is about west to east. And they were supposed to land on the south side. They landed on the north side and didn't tell John. So John gets out of the Twin Otter with his little bike and thinks he's on the north side, but nothing matches. So he goes back to the airplane. Oh, we forgot to tell you, we landed on the south side. Now he's oriented. Okay, the other thing that happened is the road had a little bend to it as it went through the dry lake bed. And John said, well, I'm going to set up lights. The whole purpose was twofold. Get soil samples so it could be analyzed later, and to land 5 lights. Not that we needed the 5 lights to land, but we needed to get back to the point where the soil samples were taken. And we called it a box in one. So it's 4 lights and then a distant light. So the whole purpose was land in the box of the 4 lights and head for the far light, and you will have landed in the area where he took the soil samples so the data would be accurate. What he didn't realize going down the bike is the road bent. So we had overhead photography later that showed that. So we compensated for it on the landing. But had we landed in the box and headed for the far light, we'd have crossed the road. Now the road had a little lip to it. Okay. Everybody says, well, why did you land in an area where there was a road? Well, for the same reason that we had to seek the firmest soil. Over the centuries, a little road developed in the same area across this dry lake bed. We knew there might be traffic on the road, so the rangers were ready for it. Okay. There were 2 plans for the rescue mission. There was a more deliberate plan when the moon was right. The moon illumination. Satellites were not developed very well yet. So we had to rely on intelligence from other sources. And the intelligence would tell us there would be people on the road. And what we had to do was come up with a more deliberate plan that went when we were ready, when the moon was right, because night vision goggles were in their infancy at that time. So we needed the moonlight to help us. But if they start putting them against the wall and shooting them, we're going in with what capability we have. So therefore, how do we train? Do we train for the more deliberate mission, landing in the desert? Or do we train for an immediate, they're shooting them, go in with what you've got? So they came up with a little airfield that we would take over on night 1, not night 2, night 1, as the more deliberate. I mean, as they're shooting them against the wall. Mm-hmm. And the whole purpose would be to come in unannounced, land at a little airfield, and then have Farsi linguists on board and try to bluff our way throughout the next day that we had seized an airfield while we inserted the Delta Force and their helicopters. But all of us knew we would prefer the more deliberate when we're ready to go. But every rehearsal we had was to seize an airfield. And then at the very last minute, we tried to validate our procedures to land in the desert by going to Rogers Dry Lake at Edwards Air Force Base and with a couple of airplanes. So when you hear the word, there was never a full-scale rehearsal, that's true, because we practiced the emergency mission, not the more deliberate mission, okay? But the whole plan was to use 6130s. And the lead would be 1 hour ahead of the other 5. The purpose for that is that if the data showed we could land and not sink to our wings, but was invalid, then we do lose only 1 airplane and not 6. So therefore, number 1 would land in the desert on the 5 lights, and then bring in people to set up an operation on both sides of the road. So we have the south runway in the desert and the north runway in the desert.
And that was Dragon 1 who went in first?
The first 3 carried the Delta Force and the Rangers. And the Rangers came along to secure the area while we did the refueling. They were not on the airplane to do the hit on the embassy. That was the Delta Force. Okay. So 1, 2, and 3 would be Rangers and the Delta Force and the commanders in the hierarchy. And then 4, 5, and 6 would be fuel carriers. They resurrected some big bladders from the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, when there was an airfield that you couldn't get water or fuel by any other means, you had some big bladders that would be put on sleds and put in the back of the C-130 and airlifted in to provide water and fuel, whatever. So that was the capability to refuel the helicopters. But in a situation like that, you don't ever shut an engine down with the C-130. All engines are running because the fear is that you wouldn't be able to start one of them. So it's a very loud, very dirty, very noisy, windy, bad environment to work in. So,
and I think you said in one of your interviews you're running a couple of these way overweight for a combat situation.
Yeah, the fuel carriers were probably 195. They were probably 40,000 pounds overgrossed. Now, there's an award in the Air Force yearly called the McKay Trophy for the most significant flight. Had we been able to disclose what we did right after the mission, they'd have probably won the McKay Trophy. Because number 1 went by itself, and I was on that one airplane, number 1. Number 2 went by itself. And number 3 led a diamond formation. So you had a combat talent as lead, you had the 3 fuel carriers on the wing and in the tail. Number 1 was terrain following in the mountains at night, 40,000 pounds over gross. Only a pilot would appreciate what I'm saying right here as far as what kind of flying you're talking about. So they'd have won the McKay Trophy had we been able to submit them. But we were preparing for a second attempt. We couldn't do that. But anyway, on the night of, first of all, where do you take off? Where do you move the force to? The problem was, in the Vietnam War, you had a war going on. So it's fairly easy to move airplanes around and get mixed up in the normal traffic of C-130s and C-141s. Here, you had no war going on. You had peacetime. So the problem was, how do you train the force in the States? And what we basically did is had a rehearsal on a 2-night mission, Friday and Saturday nights, every 3 weeks or so, to practice night 1 of the mission and night 2 as well. And we would always choose an airfield in the southwest of the United States for night 1 that had the similar topography and runway setup if we could. And then we never talked about night 2. Night 2 was going to be when the helicopters pick up the hostages and the Delta Force at the soccer stadium next to the embassy. Where do they take them? They take them to an airfield that the same C-130s that brought the fuel in on night 1 had been recycled to seize an airfield about 35 miles from Tehran. And we could not use that on night 1. It was just too close to the town. But that airfield was where the Shah used to have his air power demonstrations. So it was a big, long runway, and seizing the airfield would have been a piece of cake by the time we were getting ready to do it. But that's where the transload would have occurred. And then we had, in my squadron, we had trained 2 C-141s configured for airborne evacuation with medics aboard, etc. So once we would have seized this airfield, Manzaria was the name, then the tail end after the airfield seizure by 4 C-130s, 2 C-141s would have come in. By that time, we could have put lights down for them, and 2 C-141s would have come in. And then when the helicopters come in from the embassy, then they would have landed right behind them and ushered in the hostages into the 141s. And they have to be cognizant of what is called the Stockholm effect. The Stockholm effect is a way to treat people in a hostage situation. It has to do with a mission that I don't know much about that happened in Stockholm. But what it is passengers that are captives by another force don't like their captives, but they end up depending on them for life support, for food, for medicine, whatever. And you have to quickly, in a rescue operation, terminate that with their captors taken over. So the not the POWs, but the hostages have to be treated roughly to get them to comply and get into the 130 and not rebel against a new force taking them over. So it's a psychological thing that the SEAL teams practice, the Delta Force practices, overcoming the Stockholm effect. Okay.
That's
so
interesting.
They had to do that. So I didn't talk much about the soccer stadium. Next to the embassy, and the embassy is a very large compound, 27 acres, I think, and 14 buildings or something like that. Right next on the street, just across the street from the embassy, was a very large soccer stadium. So Delta Force was going to be divided into 3 squadrons. One would be the room clearing in the embassy. The other would be the perimeter. In other words, taking out the guards, including bursting holes in the fence between the two. Because the last thing you want in a hostage situation where you're rescuing people that may be out of shape, maybe sick, weak, is start climbing ladders over fences, over stone barricades or whatever. So the Delta Force would have blown holes in the fence to get to the soccer stadium. And the 3rd Delta Force would be to secure the soccer stadium. So the helicopters were going to come in from the Nimitz, refuel at Desert 1, where we were going to top them off with gas, and they were going to go to Desert 2, which was a mountain area pretty close to Tehran, about 40 miles, 50 miles southeast, and hunker down the rest of Night 1 if they got there early enough, and put camouflage netting over the airplanes in case anybody flew over the next day. And then Colonel Beckwith was the commander of the Delta Force, and he was adamant about wanting people he trusted with eyes on the target. So, yes, there were CIA people in Iran when the embassy fell, but they were in the embassy, and they got captured. So, whether we had American eyes that Colonel Beckwith trusted was hit and miss, but he didn't want to take any chances, so he recruited a retired Army major. I'll think of his name in a second, that lived in southeast Florida, right here. He lived close by, and he recruited him out of retired force, and he was the one that would be inserted ahead of time. If you watch Argo, what the Argo people went through to get out, he sort of did it in and out. So he was a very talented, highly experienced Army Ranger, Army Special Forces guy. He was sent to the CIA to be taught how to dress, what to put in his pocket. And he inserted ahead of time. And then there was a search in the United States military for Farsi-speaking GIs in all the services. Farsi is the language of Iran. And several were found, and they were recruited to infiltrate by other means other than the international airport. And they all met at the Sheraton, and then he bought a warehouse and some 18-wheelers and had them waiting for night 2 or night 1. On my airplane, we brought in some drivers that could speak Farsi. And if we got there early enough, then they were going to go into town and kind of reconnoiter the route ahead of time. But the whole plan for the helicopters was they'd be in this valley covered with camouflage netting on night 2. And when it's time to uncover, they get in the trucks and get into downtown Tehran as best they can, and then get in the area of the embassy. And when Colonel Beckwith says go, then the Delta Force takes out the guards. And then we would have 4 gunships from Herbert that would pop up that came in on night 2, 1 over the embassy, 1 over the international airport, 1 over the compound, the hostage, the embassy, and then a 4th one as a spare in case somebody ran out of fuel or bullets or whatever. So at H hour, they would pop up, and they had practiced very rigorously with the Delta Force using the grid system. In other words, they had matching maps put into grids, like the old battleship program, where we used to try to play each other with square number and battleship. Same principle. Use a 105 to C3 or whatever.
So they could escort them out of the city and
then helicopters would have gone to the airfield we would have seized by this time, and enacting the Stockholm Syndrome effect, put them in the C-141s, get out of Dodge, and then we shrink the perimeter of the airfield we seized with Rangers in the C-130s and get out of Dodge.
Now,
never happened.
As I understand, it took about 3 weeks from the recon mission where you determined where Desert 1 was going to be, and 3 weeks later you're putting the plan into action. But I wanted to ask about developing JSOC and what it was like taking all these branches who, like you were saying, Sante was 10 years ago.
Right.
Tell me about developing the plan, what were the rough patches, and having such a limited budget and resources to get something going like this.
Well, of course, the accident happened because the helicopter that was furthest away from the dry lake bed middle was refueling behind the C-130. And in taxiing, he damaged his nose gear. So he couldn't wheel taxi. He had to what is called hover taxi, which means he's using his rotors to kind of lift up. He's kind of flying 6 inches off the ground, okay? And that's the only way he could get in position to refuel and to get away. So he got refuel, and there was a combat controller marshaling him. And by the time he's now full of fuel, it's time for him to abort the mission because the other helicopters had landed and there were not enough operational to continue with the mission. So the abort occurred before the accident. So he's told there's still a chance to save the helicopters to try again later. So you need to move away because the C-130 that you got your fuel from was the furthest from the road in the worst sand. So in order for the C-130 to move away from the helicopter, would have thrown sand and rocks galore in the helicopter. So a decision was made to have him move out of the way before the C-130 could advance. So he lifts up, kicks up a whole bunch of dust, and the combat controller that was marshaling him gets blown over. And he was relying on the lights in the hand of the combat controller. His rotor wash pushes the guy back, and now he interprets that as him backing up, but he wasn't backing up. He was just going up. So he corrected, thinking he was going backwards, and hit the C-130. So there's ball to flame, of course, all the ammunition's cooking off. So there's no way to wait for the bodies. So we just had to leave. There were 5 fatalities in the C-130. The 2 pilots, the engineer, and 2 of the navs. And the 3rd pilot escaped, and the radio operator and the loadmasters escaped. Burns, but they escaped. And
3 from the helicopter?
Pardon me?
I think 3 from
and
the
3
helicopter.
from the helicopter. So 5 from the C-130, 3 from the helicopter. And now it's getting close to the sun coming up. So now we've got to try to get out of Dodge before it's sunlight. So everybody got into the remaining C-130s and headed for Oman to get back to where we took off from.
I do appreciate you telling me about the accident, but I do want to go back to my question and talk just about before the mission even started about the development of JSOC and was there any butting heads on developing the plan, especially with the time limit and all the factors?
Okay, the mission failed, and it was a synergistic effect in that we had a failure of the mission and hurt U.S. prestige, and we had a bad accident. So the synergistic effect of both events shocked Congress, shocked the Americans. And now what do we do about it? So Project Honey Badger was set up. What Project Honey Badger was the ruse was an effort to try to come back to the special ops capability we had at the end of the Vietnam War by throwing more assets added. The real reason for Honey Badger was preparing for a second attempt. Okay, so I was one of the chief airplaners in applying the lessons learned and the tactics developed in Eagle Claw, such as blackout landing, night vision goggle usage, refueling helicopters on the ground, refueling C-130s behind KC-135s with minimum lights and no communication. Another little thing that happened as an example. All of a sudden, a radio operator from Delta comes to my office during the preparations, and he says, I have this antenna, and it's a satellite antenna, and I've been told to mount it on one of your airplanes for our rehearsal coming up this weekend. And General Vaught wants it on the airplane that's going to be the lead on the mission. I said, well, that airplane's in the Pacific right now, because those airplanes in the Pacific have forward-looking infrared, FLIR. So they're going to be the lead airplane, not the ones that hurl it. And he said, well, he wants to test airborne refueling and satellite communications. What do we do? I said, well, let me look at the antenna. A C-130 has 3 overhead escape hatches in case you ditch the airplane, and it's floating on the wings, so you can escape through the top of the airplane. And the opening is a circle. And I said, let me take a look at the antenna and see if it'll fit by being inserted. If you took the antenna and mounted it on the hatch and then inserted the hatch with the antenna mounted, would it work? Is the antenna of a diameter small enough to go through the hole. And sure enough, it was. Now, is there any problem refueling the airplane based on where you put the antenna? So we chose the one up front. We had Lockheed Ontario mount the antenna on a hatch, inserted the hatch, went to altitude, no test plan, nothing. We just went to 200 knots and the antenna's still there. 210, it's still there. 220, it's still there. So that was our test. So that concept was used in the Air Force for 40 years, in that if your airplane is not SATCOM capable, the communications unit brought their own hatch-mounted antenna with them and swapped it out. But the whole concept of Honey Badger was to capture all these things that were developed by crew members, blackout landings, all that stuff, and institutionalize them and get ready for a second attempt. The Iranians were not smart enough to move the hostages before Eagle Claw, but finally they were smart enough after. So Honey Badger never went because we couldn't pinpoint where the hostages were because the Iranians kept moving them. Okay, so a commission was appointed called the Holloway Commission. And the whole purpose was, if the military doesn't investigate itself, Congress will. Okay? So the military jumped the gun and assigned to Admiral Holloway, a retired chief of naval operations, a commission of other general officers, Marines, Army, Air Force, Navy, to investigate everything about our training for Eagle Claw and what the recommendations were going forward. And they came up with Eagle Claw was probably the best plan they could have come up with. We had bad luck with helicopters, but going forward, you can't saute it and Eagle Claw it again if something comes up. You can't build an ad hoc task force when something goes down. You're going to have a force in place with a SEAL team, with an Army Ranger Battalion, with a Delta Force, with Air Force airplanes, whatever, in place, practicing with each other, learning how to do all that stuff on the same frequencies. And that's what JSOC was. It was called the Counterterrorist Joint Task Force for classification purposes, but the real name was JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command. Then where do you put it? The Army wanted it at Fort Bragg. The commander that was appointed wanted it at Herbert. The Army won, okay? So it got formed at Fort Bragg. In November of 1970, Honey Badger did a graduation exercise with the new JSOC people observing, and that was the turnover. I was sent to JSOC as the first chief of air operations, and the graduation exercise was the seizing of Reese Air Force Base with 14 fixed-wing airplanes filled with what is called little birds. They're MH-53s, not 53, but LOH, Light Observation Helicopter, each one carrying Delta operators. So we seized Reese Air Force Base in July and in September on a Sunday night at about midnight. We're planning ahead of time, like move their airplanes so they don't get damaged, whatever. But the JSOC people that were being assigned to JSOC all witnessed what was going on. And then that was November of 1980 was when JSOC was blessed as the force. And of course, JSOC was in the shadows for 30, 35 years. Nobody knew he existed. I spent 3 years initially in the command. And that's the organization that took down bin Laden. That's the organization that took down the Somali pirates. and many, many more that you never heard about.
Absolutely. Now, a few years after the formation of JSOC, there was another operation to put all this training and strategy, tactics into action in Grenada. Could you tell me a little bit about what happened there and your involvement in solving that hostage crisis?
Yes. Reagan was president, and JSOC had been in existence almost 3 years. By that time, we had perfected the airfield seizure. One of our biggest problems was the Army at that time had 2 Ranger battalions, 1st of the 75th and 2nd of the 75th. And they would designate one battalion as the Ready Battalion. 6 months later, they would switch with many new personnel. So JSOC spent most of its time getting the Ranger battalions current as they switched from their 6 month to the next 6 month. But SEAL Team 6 was formed under a madman known as Richard Morsinko, of Rogue Warrior fame. So JSOC ended up having an Army component, a Navy component, and an Air Force component.
My apologies. You were saying it had an Army, Navy, and Air Force.
Yeah, JSOC was formed to have 3, here's the key, assigned forces. It was not just a headquarters that when a mission comes in, they pull a unit from the field to be attached to JSOC. They were assigned to JSOC, okay? So it would be Air Force, Army, and Navy. Navy, at that time, had 2 SEAL teams. SEAL Team 1 on the West Coast, SEAL Team 2 on the East Coast. Coronado and Little Creek. Coronado, California, Little Creek, Virginia. They formed a new SEAL team, put it under the command of the Navy's equivalent to Charlie Beckwith, which was Richard Morsinko. Those 2 were unique individuals that formed the Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 like nobody else could have, based on their personality and character. Okay, I ain't one of those. All right. So therefore, Morsinko, instead of saying SEAL Team 3, he said, I'm going to fool the Russians. I'm going to say SEAL Team 6, when there was no 3, 4, or 5. Okay? Spent money like he had more ammunition money than the Marine Corps in 1 year. So he got them trained. I mean, climbing oil rigs and cruise ships and mountains to get their fingers, whatever. Now, the Army had the problem with the Delta Forces trained to be brought to a hostage barricade target, brought to it in a cooperating country and settle a hostage barricade situation. They're not trained to be airlifted in to fight their way in. So the Army had to have 2 components, a Ranger battalion, and whichever one of the 6-month periods it is, that was called the Ready Battalion. But like I said, JSOC spent almost all of its time training the new Ready Battalion because they had so much turnover since they were the Ready Battalion 6 months ago, okay? So the Rangers were brought in to assist the Delta Force to get them to where they could apply the hostage barricade techniques like an airplane at an airport, okay? They would provide security and whatever, and the actual takedown of the airplane would be the Delta Force, not the Rangers, okay? The Air Force is a little different because we didn't have enough assets to assign them to Pope Air Force Base adjacent to Fort Bragg to be used by JSOC on a daily basis. So in case of the Air Force, there had to be a little office of a commander and a staff that could instantly pick up the phone to Hurlburt or wherever and say, we need these assets, and to train with them and to know them well enough that there'd be no learning curve. So I was the second Air Force component commander of JSOC. And I served in that capacity for all the exercises. And we did an exercise called Night Striker. And then my 3 years was up, and it was time for me to go. Night Striker turned out to be a rehearsal for Grenada, because Reagan said, you're going now, you don't have time for a rehearsal. So we used the thing we had done in Night Striker, the techniques and whatever, and almost changed things en route. But the point is, the command and control airplane was there, used by General Schultes, the commander of JSOC. All the forces had been working together more recently, in 3 or 4 weeks earlier in Night Striker. So the Air Force had no problem with Urgent Fury, which was the rescue of American medical students on the island of Grenada. The problem was they had one target, the Marines had another target. Marines couldn't go in nighttime. They had to wait till the sun came up, which defeats the purpose of what JSOC had been training for years, to go in at night at your advantage. So there were some glitches here and there, but it worked out.
Ultimately, yeah. Just a few other questions to wrap us up today. I told you I wouldn't take up your whole night. What's maybe one of the biggest leadership challenges you faced in your many years in the Air Force?
Well, my biggest problem in the squadron was the fact that I hadn't flown for 8 years, and I didn't come up in the ranks of a special operations pilot in C-130s. I was flying on the ice cap in Greenland or launching drones. Now, the profile for a drone launch mission is a special ops profile. What do I mean by that? You take off in the dead of night, no radio calls. You use a ruse to make sure, convince people you're not who you are, and you hit an objective. Now, what is the objective? Is it dropping clandestine people? Is it launching a drone? You just have to get to a certain point of time at a certain time and do something with your C-130. So I was qualified from a leadership position in applying what I learned in Vietnam on 110 drone launches, all top secret, all in enemy territory. But the credibility was not there when I got to the squadron, because I hadn't come up special ops routine, hadn't flown for 8 years. And I'm an engineer, I'm a planner. I'm not your lead them to the bar, gregarious, 12 o'clock high type guy, okay? So my point is, my challenge was to convince people that I could lead them in spite of the fact that I may not lead them at the bar, okay? If that's the right word to use.
I get the meaning. But yeah, in Iran, there's nothing to obfuscate anything. Not 100 flights a day that you could hide behind. It was
every mission that I flew in Southeast Asia was more complicated than the landing at Desert One. Everyone, because we were chased by MiGs, we were chased by AAA. We had weather. We had all the issues in Southeast Asia. I'm not downplaying Desert One. I'm just saying that I know what a special ops profile is like, and how to enact one, and how to lead one. But that's probably my biggest challenge.
Now, a lot of your ordinary people have whatever illusion about special operations. What do you want people to know and remember about special operations through the years?
In special operations, you can get by with almost anything once. You can get by with almost anything once. And that the right person to be a special operations person is a quiet professional. You don't need a ticker tape parade. You need to be given a mission and an objective and accomplish it and come away knowing you did your best, regardless of the outcome, to accomplish the mission as a quiet professional. And if that doesn't suit your personality, you need to apply for the Thunderbirds.
Now, is there any song that if you heard today would put you back in the seat of a C-130?
A song? You got something in mind?
No, everyone might have a song that was memorable on a flight. Maybe you were stuck in your head, but I don't know. I just always ask because everyone's got their own personal song.
No.
Even if it's the Air Force hymn.
No, I can't think of any, and I got a musical background. I can't think of any song that fits special ops.
Oh, no worries. It's just an open question. Obviously, you worked with a lot of really impressive people in your career. Is there anybody that sticks out in your mind as having a real big impact on you?
Yeah, the person that was selected to be first commander of JSOC, his name is Richard Schultes, Scholtes, European extraction, not your typical Army guy. But he had to tackle the issue of jointness because the service had just played lip service to jointness. But he was faced with a command that had Air Force, Navy, Marines, and he had to deal with he didn't have to deal with Beckwith very long because Beckwith would not have done good in a staff job. Beckwith was the right person to form the Delta Force. He never made general. He never would make general because he was just that kind of guy. Same with Marcinko. Okay? So Schultes had to deal with those two characters. But when JSOC was formed, initially it was assumed that Beckwith had been exposed so much that he would be the J3 or the operations guy for JSOC. But it couldn't happen. Like there was a reception when the hostages were finally released on January 20th, 81. And they came back to the States and got medical taken care of. And then there was a big reception in the south lawn of the White House. I couldn't go. I was not allowed to go. Because I was going to be the JSOC J3 Air. And I had been exposed too much. Because we were groomed like the Delta Force. 2 passports and all that stuff. In case we got caught somewhere. Special ops is a dedicated career field that not everybody would want to stay in because they don't necessarily want to fade into the shadows and resume the world of a quiet professional. You just have to be ready to judge your self-satisfaction based on the mission given to you and accomplishing it. And I had a grooming of that launching drones, and never knowing whether a drone I launched discovered extremely important intelligence. I was just given, you had 7 targets, you hit 4. Now let's worry about the next mission.
And that's, the tip of what warfare would be for the next 50 years. It's launching drones for reconnaissance. It's amazing, your career, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time this afternoon to share your stories with me. It's really an honor and a pleasure. But most importantly, I want to thank you so much for your service. We greatly appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you.